the moment I realized Afrobeats and Afrobeat weren't the same thing, I went down this huge rabbit hole, and it made me understand the music industry and how we look at music and genres in a way I didn't understand before. So I came across an interview by Burna Boy a little while ago that was him basically saying that what he makes isn't Afro beats, and the only person that made Afro beats was an artist named Fela Kuti. And so I didn't know who this was, so I decided to do some research. And boy, was I misinformed, or are we all misinformed? Fela Kuti is credited with the creation of Afro beat, which is different than Afro beats, and I'm gonna get to that. But basically, he was born in Nigeria, and at the time they were under British rule. They were a British colony, and he was born to scholars and educators, and they wanted him to get educated. He ended up going to London and instead becoming a musician, where he was exposed to a lot of jazz music. He starts a band. He moves back to Nigeria, and during this time, Nigeria has just gained its independence. So it's no longer the British colony of Nigeria. It is now the Independent Federation of Nigeria. They went through this weird period when they were gaining their independence. And so when he came back, him and his band are playing. They decide to take the band and go record an album in Los Angeles this is 1969. So during 1969 was around the height of the Black Panther Party. And Fela Kuti has been on record saying how much of an impact this had on him and his music and just his personality and stuff like that. He ended up having these political views that were a lot more radical than they were when he went into it. Like, obviously coming from a British colony and going into now an independent federation, like, he had a lot of feelings about just colonization and things of that nature. So his feelings were probably similar to a lot of the people in the Black Panther Party. But during this time, he changes his band's name to Nigeria 70. They go back to Africa, and they start making what he called Afrobeat at the time. They later changed their name to Africa 70, and he starts making music with a lot of political ideology in it, talking about how he's very proud to be Black and Nigerian, and talking about the mistreatment that a lot of people in the area at the time were going through, because just because they had gained their independence didn't mean things were fair. But the most interesting thing to me about just his creation, about the change and the shift to when it really became Afrobeat and why he named it that, he wanted to find a way to unify Africa. And so while initially when I heard the name Afrobeat or Afrobeats, when I heard that, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, how are you going to identify an entire country's music under one umbrella? Because it's probably all not the same. So Afrobeat becomes a principle or like a staple in Nigeria for a very long time. And so time goes on. And as we know, a lot of Africans immigrate to London, to UK, because they're looking for a better life. And a lot of their kids are born there. And so they have a lot of ties to Africa and the countries there, but it's a different thing. A lot of people on the London scene at the time were coming across a lot of types of music. And it's crazy when you think about it now, because back then it was a lot of dancehall, a lot of jungle, a lot of African music. But, you know, the people in that area didn't know how to identify it. And so they didn't know what to call it because there were a lot of African immigrants there. And so the DJs, the music labels, they were all starting to identify it as Afro beats, right? Like, they kept hearing the term Afro beat, which was a genre already in Africa. And they just identified, it's crazy, they just identified the Black people in the area who were making music under this umbrella of Afro beats because they didn't know what to call it. And so a lot of the music there, though, was not the same as Afrobeat. It wasn't the same thing. It was a lot more modern. It was a lot more popularized. They took a lot of influence from a lot of American artists because America was the biggest at the time. And so looking back on it now, like, you had artists who, like, made it to prominence, like Wizkid and Burna Boy, and they're coming up and saying, like, we're not making Afrobeats. That's not what this is. It's not Afrobeats, because they thought they were referring to Afrobeat, which was already popular in Nigeria at the time, because nobody was calling it Afrobeats, what they were doing at the time. Only the people in, like, London and America and people who were misinformed were calling it Afrobeats. They weren't calling it Afrobeats there. And so now we run into this situation where it's like, you're listening to music from Nigeria, from Ghana, from wherever, and we're calling it Afrobeats when they don't even refer to it as that. And so for the longest time, I'm sitting here like, why are they calling it this? But then I realized you have to look at it from the perspective of us being the minority in those majority white or those majority European or American spaces, right? It's like if you're trying to identify with a group of black people and you can't even tell the difference between the tribes or the countries over there and what types of music each one is making and the sounds that's going on, you're going to throw it under this one umbrella. So like I can understand how people in the UK who don't really understand what they're selling are going to just call it, okay, this is African, these are people in Africa, African music, Afrobeats, just throw the label on it. And that made me really consider like genres as a whole. Like if you look at music here, they sort of do the same thing. Like you don't really see that many black people in pop. They really keep you out of pop. We own hip hop and R&B. And even on the streaming platforms, when I go to Spotify and I want to listen to, let's say I click Afrobeats because I know the type of music they're going to show me, they'll throw dancehall artists in there too, which to me means one or two things. One, they don't care enough to try and distinguish the two because they're different things, at least to us they are, or they can't tell the difference. And so I understand they're trying to do their best to make it easier for the consumer, for the person who's going to have to go in the app and try and listen to and distinguish the music. But I feel like it's a little dishonest in a way. Like when you're showing me one thing and you're saying this is Afrobeats and I'm getting somebody from Jamaica or somebody from Trinidad or somebody from St. Vincent or somebody from anywhere else, it's like, okay, if I didn't know better, I didn't have the inkling of the idea to go look, I'm going to assume that one is the other. And I don't think that's fair to those artists. What do you guys think? Did you guys know any of this? Was any of this like news to you? Did you know the difference between the two? And have you found things like that happening to you where you were like, okay, this is one artist or this is one type of music, and you do a little research and it's something completely different?